Welcome, Educate US listeners. Today I am joined by Reginald Richardson. To many of us, he's known as Reggie. Reggie is driven by a lifelong passion for social justice and draws over 20 years of experience as an award-winning teacher and high school principal. New York City native, Reginald Richardson founded Earthseed Consulting LLC. Through Earthseed, he empowers educators to reimagine schools as joyful spaces, free from anti-Blackness and catalysts for transformational change worldwide. Reggie's commitment to education extends beyond Earthseed. He's also a founding partner of the Skybridge Group, a real estate company fostering cultural, political, lifestyle, and economic connections between Black Americans and South Africa. A graduate of Brooklyn Tech High School, Reggie holds a BA in political science from Hunter College, an EDM in teaching and curriculum from Harvard, and an MSED in educational leadership from Baruch College. And if that wasn't enough, he also holds a JD from Howard University School of Law. Reggie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Geez Louise, boy, that's a lot of words.
Just a testament to the total amazing dynamic energy you bring to life and to anyone you interact with.
Well, I appreciate you. I appreciate you folks having me here, and thank you so much.
Absolutely. So, Reggie, we had a chance to, connect before the show and just kind of talk about some of the things that are top of mind for you and many of us, right, in the world. And one of those things that we really were diving into was the dismantling of communities
Yeah,
across so many sectors right now, from education to business to just neighborhoods.
right.
Um, so to understand this, you were drawing some really interesting historical parallels that I thought we could talk about here. So if you want to, can you talk us through how did some of those periods like Reconstruction, the New Deal, help to shape or fail to shape rather community structures? And how would you compare that to what's happening right now?
Okay, so let's see. That's a big question, and I think I'll probably start with, um, the so I think we're kind of experiencing the original sin of America, which was about the disruption of communities to prioritize other communities, right? So when you think about the occupation of what we now call the United States and the extermination of the original inhabitants of this place, talk about disruption to community, right? There's no more disruptive thing than exterminating the original inhabitants. And then when you look at the next big piece of disruption that happens with the stealing of Africans from the continent, for over 2 centuries and repopulating what we now call the Americas with those people, those souls, and then the millions and millions of people who were just lost during the Middle Passage from Africa to the Americas. So disruption of communities, there on the continent in terms of some of the best, strongest, most able people removed from their communities, destroying those communities that existed to then use that skill to build the communities here. And then you go through the historical periods of, what some consider America's original sin of slavery, and then the end of it during Reconstruction, where there was this small window of hope during the Reconstruction period that we could confront those evils and begin anew. But we chose not to, as a country, to do that. We chose instead to double down on the inhumanity that existed before, you know, through the civil rights era, where we were kind of dragged kicking and screaming into trying to live up to the promise that was in those documents of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and where it looked like we were kind of on a path to really finally fulfilling those things, with the election of President Obama. But then that actually ignites a severe backlash that drags us back to this moment of communities literally again being destroyed with removals of longtime residents who are now labeled as illegal immigrants and being dragged from their homes, dragged from the only lives they knew indiscriminately, and being housed in Guantanamo Bay. So there's almost like a full circle. And I know I skipped a bunch of stuff there in that big sweep, but it brings us to this moment.
Mm. You know, obviously you skipped, but I thought you did a really wonderful job of sort of summarizing, as you said, the disruption of communities and how we kind of got back to this moment. Furthering that thought of disruption of communities, where right now are you seeing like legal and policy shifts that are really supporting that as you mentioned, like in a backlash kind of way?
What's happening right now, although there's like a historical precedent in terms of things that existed before the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, the civil rights laws that were passed during the struggle in the 50s and 60s, the court cases that have been won, we see a stripping away of almost all of those gains with a stroke of a pen. And what's really stunning to me is the quiet and the politeness in response to what's happening. There's an eerie silence in the face of people being rounded up, put in chains, put on planes. There was a report that a group of immigrants who were rounded up and were being deported to India. There was an 18-hour flight where these folks were in shackles for 18 hours and unable to use the restroom, couldn't go to the bathroom. The images of this have not resulted in people en masse taking to the streets. So that the quiet and the politeness, the refusal to name what is happening as recently I just read a story about a school district, I forget where it was, where they made a rule against displaying the gay pride flag, but were okay with the Confederate flag and the swastika being displayed in those schools. But the quiet, the acceptance of what's happening is what's actually the stunning part. Uh, Trump and the MAGA movement are doing exactly what they said they were going to do. They're doing exactly what they promised when they ran. There was no subterfuge, right? Everything was laid out in the Project 2025 that was made public. This over 900-page document that itemized step by step exactly what would be happening in the early days, and it's all happening. So that is happening is not surprising, but the very muted, quiet, polite response is what I find a bit stunning.
Reggie, that brings up so many different thoughts as you're talking about that. You know, it makes me think of a clip, right, that they've been showing lately around Steve Bannon, right, talking about one way to sort of what you're talking about, like sort of quiet and stun people is just hit them, right? Keep hitting them, hitting them. And I forget the exact term he used, right? But it's what we're seeing right now, right? It's like every day in the news, there are multiple attacks. I call them attacks personally, right? I call them attacks on the American people because it's not just this small group of people that Trump is, well, mostly himself, but Trump and his people are really trying to what? Better protect. I'm not even sure what their exact um goal is really in the end, right? Of course, you can read Project 25. A lot of it was just about dismantling and taking money back and redistributing it back to essentially the wealthy, right? And that's we can definitely see that in Project 2025. But what we are not saying, right, as a people is like, this is an attack on us as a people. And I can't help but wonder around, how actually the human mind works, and that this is a lot for most people to take in. And so while I too am stunned, especially from a political standpoint, that there was no offensive playbook being written. Like, where was that? This, to your point, right? You can look back, that Project 2025 was out there, it was being talked about.
There's a
Where's the,
website, you can go
yeah.
download it. There was absolutely no shame about this thing except when, Trump lied during the campaign. He said, "Oh, I don't really know about that," except one of the main architects of this book, this playbook, is now a member of his cabinet. So, go figure.
Yeah. So I guess I too am stunned and disheartened that there isn't more of an offensive playbook. And we're going to get to proactivity and actions we can take, right, on a community-based level soon. But before we get there, yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
Um, so to your point, we are being hit by an avalanche of criminality, corruption, malfeasance, illegality, illegitimacy, uh, and it is all being couched in the name of, ironically, saving democracy, when the exact opposite is happening, dismantling democracy. And what's different, and so America experienced this before during the rise of fascism right before World War II, where our democracy was under assault with disinformation and Nazi sympathizers who were looking, and we came in many ways very close to being on the other side of that conflict, being on the wrong side of history. Um, but what was different at that time was the ability to flood the zone with different disinformation was a lot more difficult, where you did not have this ability to exist in an information silo in the same way that we are siloed by algorithms now. So that people are getting a really distorted view of what's happening, what's true and what's not true, the ability to sift through disinformation and get to truth and fact, the willingness of the members of the Fourth Estate to be complicit in circulating disinformation under the guise of First Amendment freedoms and freedom of speech. I was listening to a podcast recently, and they were interviewing some lawmakers in Germany, and they were talking about how in Germany it is illegal to circulate disinformation or things that are factually incorrect, and there's a consequence for it. And even if you're just repeating something on social media that someone else sent out, there's a law against that, right? Um, and because they've lived through one of the most horrific events in modern history, the documented extermination or attempt to exterminate a people, documented in film, photographs, writing, like not something that we have to reconstruct just from obscure writings that somebody may have put down, but we can actually see the victims of that horror. And we are now in a place where, in Germany, this place that has this history, they're on the brink of fighting to suppress this right-wing rise of Nazism once again, supported by the new American administration. So I guess I say all of that to say that what the challenge that we have now is that the information zone has been flooded with so much disinformation and lies, and we have this unique time that we live in where now people get most of their information from their social media platforms, which are now controlled by a handful of corporations that can amplify or tamp down this the information that they want people to receive or keep people in these silos. It becomes more difficult than ever to break through that, and the interpersonal relationships that we have with each other are going to be more important than ever.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so happy you touched on the misinformation. I mean, this is just rampant right now. And we even saw right before the inauguration, right? Meta stepped back on their fact checking,
Correct.
right? And so it's interesting in Germany, right? They have a law against it. And here we have a corporation who's not even willing to keep that in place, let alone,
Even willing to keep it in place. And then I think about some of the respected, news organizations who have
mhm.
now been chilled as a result of what's happening. I think about, the Washington Post's refusal to do what they've traditionally done in terms of endorsing candidates. I'm thinking about recently, AP has been banned from White House coverage because of their refusal to use the term Gulf of America, and just the United States unilaterally renaming an international water body at the Gulf of America. And they're like, well, it's not Gulf of America, it's Gulf of Mexico. And so it would be irresponsible of us because they were one of the few who refused to go along to get along. They're now on the outside looking in. And there's more coming because the new director of the FBI, Kash Patel, if people remember, one of the more infamous FBI directors, Herbert Hoover, who leveraged the power of the FBI against dissent here in America. And specifically, it was aimed during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s at the civil rights movement, at the civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, etc. And it was a targeted attempt to disrupt and end the organizations that supported the movement for Black civil rights and equality and liberation. This Kash Patel, it's a very scary thing because now the weight of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, can be targeted against people who articulate dissent. And there already was a story reported about a business whose assets were frozen by Elon Musk because they did not comply in some way with some request of Donald Trump's. So the threat of the IRS and the FBI and the Justice Department being leveraged against just ordinary citizens who are exercising our right to free speech is a very, very scary thing. And we're just at the very beginning of this.
I couldn't agree with you more, Reggie. Recently I was listening to, or rather reading a interview with Thomas Friedman, and he said, it was an opinion piece, but he was like, the only thing I can count on now is physics, is
Yeah,
math,
yeah,
because I'm betting on the laws of gravity here.
yeah.
That something, some opposing force has to happen against these motions because it's true, like politically, even legally, right? It seems like there's just hurdle and hurdle and hurdle to really pushing back on these, as we mentioned, disruption, misinformation, and attacks on just everyday citizens. It is a really interesting time right now, and also, as you mentioned, really scary. So before we move into, well, what can we do? Any other thoughts or things coming up for you?
I just think about the calculation that was made about pressing. It felt like Trump's first term was kind of feeling out where the soft spots and weaknesses were in our democratic framework. and how to exacerbate those gaps that existed. And I think the ultimate test of it was the January 6th insurrection and the idea that I could try to basically overturn an American election without consequence. And that was, I think, the Rubicon. That's where we crossed into a space that was hard to come back from. And so, with that, this term where we see the avalanche of things that are in process of dismantling American democracy as we know it, um, and the measure of what the pushback would be when there was a violent insurrection where police officers were harmed, where people were killed, um, and no, there was no consequence except for a few of the foot soldiers who then ultimately are now walking around free. But there was no consequence for the architects of that. Then the calculation was made, well, there, if that didn't do it, then what's happening right now, what could possibly be the pushback, right? So I think we're now again that that chicken is coming home to roost that we did not take a very principled stand on that insurrection.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. And we just recently are also seeing the Trump and the administration stepping into the organization that oversees potential interference with elections.
Correct.
So we're seeing, where do we push the limits? Where do we misinformation, right? There's like this really big intersection right now of, I agree, they're pushing the limits on all of that to see exactly how far they can go and how much they can dismantle democracy. And I imagine the plan is what, for him to stay president forever? I mean, he recently posted, right? Long live the king. I mean, it's definitely a shift. And I do wonder what are going to be those opposing forces from Newton's law. Do you have any thoughts on what you think might be those opposing forces that really potentially start to set us on a different track and away from where we're headed right now?
Well, on the pessimistic side, again, because this feels like a repeat of the time uh, right before the rise of the Third Reich. Um, the opposing force ended up being the deaths of millions and millions of innocent people, the conquering of neighboring countries, and being pulled into a world war. Like it took that in order for, as a world community, to collectively band together and push back against that, right? So, yes, there was the opposing force eventually came, but at what cost, right? And in this era where most Americans, and ironically, not the Americans who have come from other countries escaping from war and famine seeking refuge here, and other than those who've served in the military, most Americans know nothing of war. And so the idea of the horror of it is not something that people can really understand. And so my fear is that will it take getting to that point before people become animated? Or is it enough that we have the knowledge about what's happened before to say, well, we don't want to get to that point. We don't want to wait until there are extermination camps in America, until till the whole world is pulled into a horrific war. So that's on the pessimistic end of the pushback. On the more optimistic end is that some of these horrible things that are currently happening is starting to touch regular Americans. the mass firing of federal employees. But what a lot of Americans didn't know was federal employees don't just work in Washington, D.C. They work in all over the country, including small rural counties and towns. And that they had no idea of how important those federal dollars were to their own little local economies. And so now we're starting to hear some rumblings from folks who were Trump supporters and MAGA supporters with having no idea of how our federal government operates and the extent to which they all benefit. The fact that it's the red states that benefit the most from federal dollars, and that it's a lot of the blue states who get back less than we send out in tax money. And so that reality, and so that pushback may come from small on the ground folk who are like all of a sudden feeling the discomfort, who are now going to have to pay more for their medications, who are not going to have access to health care, who are losing employment and jobs, who are paying more for goods because of tariffs. Like that would activate the self-interest that then begins the pushback that you speak of. So that's on the optimistic end of the scale. Reality, I think, is we're going to end somewhere in between. I don't think it's going to be enough because we're still in a place where, the lie that, well, any discomfort you're experiencing as a result of my policies is really a leftover from the Biden administration. That's a lie that's being sold to Trump supporters right now. But that's only going to last for about, I don't know how so long. But if it's enough to allow, for instance, the complete entrenchment of Trump loyalists in the Department of Justice and the FBI and the IRS. I'm looking at those entities specifically because those then become the bludgeon to put against dissenters, to aim against media platforms, businesses, people's livelihood and their lives themselves. When you're threatened with imprisonment or silence, most people will choose the silence. When you're threatened with financial ruin or silence, most people will choose the silence. So at the point that those folks become entrenched, and because they took the measure, they said our legal system, which would be the last bulwark against this, moves at such a glacial pace that we know that we could enact our agenda before the courts even read their first brief. And, and the case in point was Donald Trump's criminal trials for, the documents for the insurrection, how that never came to fruition because of the glacial pace with which the courts moved, forgetting the fact that, he also holds the Supreme Court in the palm of his hand. So I haven't even gotten to that part. So there's a small window of time for us to begin to really engage locally in our communities and right now our last line of defense, other than the courts, are the governors of our states. Last line of defense. So, and we'll see what happens. I heard an interesting theory about I think there are three special elections in the House that are in mostly red districts. But if there was a complete focused effort by um, by Democrats or progressives to try to capture those three seats, throwing everything you have at it, maybe there's a possibility. I mean, you got two Democratic senators from Georgia, which some thought were an impossibility. I remember the special election in Alabama where there was a Democratic Senator, Jones. He was elected in a special election in Alabama, which no one would ever expect. That's a possible because then that becomes more immediate relief if you can get control of the House. And then you can begin to demand the accountability and begin to exercise some check on the power of the executive branch. So those are maybe some more immediate kinds of things that could help, but who knows?
Yeah, I think those are really good points of because yes, the courts, but also who the enforcers, right? The people who hold them accountable need to also be active. And so you're mentioning the House and having control of that and hopefully putting in some accountability measures, I think is going to be really important. It's interesting too, because you said the interpersonal relationships through all this are going to be so important. And beyond just the silos and algorithms, right, that we hear that really create some misinformation, it often is from interpersonal relationships too, right? Because that creates its own silo and echo chamber of this is what we believe, this is what we believe. So when you're saying an all out effort, to me, it's about really going into those communities and having meaningful conversations with people so that they're not just hearing it from maybe, their neighbor and their best friend who has similar views to them and maybe are hearing the same information over and over again. So I do think there's something exciting about that. Well, I really believe in voter rights and like to get involved in voting efforts anyway, but I do think having those conversations in the communities are going to be really key to not just shifting the political landscape, but also the direction of the country.
Absolutely. I think, one of the challenges, even with the interpersonal pieces, are in America, 75% of white Americans have self-segregated in terms of their communities. And when you look at the voter base for Trump, that's white Americans. 92% of Black women, 80% of Black men did not choose this. But here we are. So, and if we're in the community just talking to ourselves, that's not going to be as effective. So I want to be specific about where those conversations need to happen. The conversations don't need to happen amongst Black women. The conversations don't need to happen amongst Black men. 80% of Black men, 92%. So you go, well, who are the people who chose this? Those are the people that we now need to speak to. And because these communities are self-segregated, it becomes really important that folk who have access to those communities begin to have those honest conversations. And I think another thing that made this MAGA movement so successful was, although it was based on lies and fear, it was very plain spoken. It was not, people did not mince their words. And I feel on our side of the people who are in favor of humanity, I'm going to say, it's not the same. There's a lot of polite kind of, we use these kind of terms to, instead of saying racist, white nationalist, white Christian nationalist, we don't, because they're too inflammatory and we don't, but, a book is a book, a duck is a duck. And if you try to call a duck, I don't know, a woodpecker, it's not a woodpecker. Yes, they're both birds, but the inauthenticity in actually saying what is happening to people, how this would harm people, how these other positions are inhumane. There are only a handful of folks that I see, at least from a political leadership standpoint, who are willing to do that. J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, gave an amazing speech in his State of the State address. I think was it 2 days ago or something like that, where he took, I mean, it was just very eloquent and elegantly stated, but also direct. And even though he got some boos in his state house as he delivered this message, he stood up and said what needed to be said in a plain way. I see Jasmine Crockett in the House of Representatives also speaking truth to power and speaking plainly in a way and with a passion and an urgency that the moment demands. And I think more of that then moves people to the actions that they need to take to have the courage to speak to our relatives, our friends, our loved ones who have basically, maybe unknowingly, just giving folks the benefit of the doubt, taking a position that's against humanity and helping them find their way back to humanity. I think those interpersonal relationships where people, it has to be where people feel that there's a source that's more trusted than the internet for them. Right now, people feel the internet YouTube, whatever, are their most trusted sources. But maybe if it's your brother, sister, cousin, aunt, those people who you love and respect, who are giving you a different way to look at what's happening, maybe that then makes people change their position. But I think we can't be delusional or generalistic about who we need to talk to, because then we end up talking to the converted, which Democrats do a lot. And not saying, well, here's the breakdown of who voted for this. Let's go talk to them. Here's a breakdown of people, and we have to explain, how did you vote against the like, and some of it is going to be, they're going to, learn from the experience of what's happening, and then going to have questions about it, and then being able to show how actually you supported something that was against your own interests, not in an accusatory way, but just in a matter of fact way and in a plain way. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you're saying that, but one of the things I want to note is because I do a lot of work around elections, I actually don't talk to anyone who always votes Democrat or who is a registered Democrat. I usually personally talk to independents or people who are Republican and at some point in their whole life maybe voted for a Democrat, right? Because they have that list.
mhm.
And it could be, someone years and years ago, but that idea and then also just in where the races are closest, talking personally to Republicans. So they do have those lists and they do make those efforts. And, it is interesting because one of the things that I hear again and again is I'm not sure. I don't know what to believe or who to believe
Yes.
because everyone in my circle is telling me this.
Yes.
Right. And it's like,
Yes.
it's so sometimes I actually just find making space for people to say those things out loud, to start to question it themselves,
Yes.
has been really powerful. Now, I don't know which way they voted in the end, but I do find some level of hope that maybe some of those people did vote differently because now they were given some confidence to question it from their own mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I agree. I 100% agree with you. I think as a Democratic Party, we need to get better about being clear and straight about things versus, and almost, I hate to say it, catchy, right? Some of the most powerful movements in the Republican Party have been because it's easy to say. And it's like you just convince people because it's like a catchphrase and they can say it easy. I mean, it's almost like a advertising skill, that winds up being employed.
But I don't minimize the Herculean task that's in front of us. It's easier to blow something up than to build something, right? So you can blow something up in seconds, and it may take years to build something. It's easier to circulate a lie than a truth because a truth requires vetting, verification, identifying sources, that sort of thing before if you're a responsible journalist, for instance. Like, I look at the right-wing media and the more progressive, or just forget progressive, just the actual regular normal media, right? Because I almost don't even like to use the word conservative, because what we're seeing happening has nothing to do with conservatism. It has everything to do with fascism and oligarchy. But the time it takes if you're a responsible journalist, so if you're a news organization and you want to verify your sources, and you want to make sure what you're saying is accurate and true before you disseminate it, the lie that the right wing media echo chamber puts out can circulate 5 times already, because there's no vetting, there's no checking sources, there is no, is this correct? It's just whatever somebody pulled out of their behind that day, they circulate it, it becomes the truth, it circles, then it starts to bleed over, and then now we have to scramble to see, well, is that true? And when we're fact checking the lies instead of doing the reporting that needs to be done on what's happening. So we have to reimagine the infrastructure that we need to engage in this fight. It is not going to be the traditional infrastructure, the traditional way of doing things. You have to have a group of people who are ready to respond to the lies. Then you have another group of people who are working on the facts and getting that. And so you need like a different teams. Like a football team. You have special teams coming out. You have your defense coming out. You have your offense coming out, and they're taking the field at different times at different points, as opposed to the traditional way, where by the time a story is vetted and checked, it doesn't even it's irrelevant because the lie has replaced it. So a change in tactics. So in addition to like thinking about to how do we make it more digestible and coining phrases, but also thinking about even the structure of our communications has to be totally different. They did a brilliant job of utilizing online influencers, right? Again, instead of using journalists, they use people who are constantly just churning out content, right? So we need that happening as well with the things we already know are true. So that we have enough that we know are true that we can begin to just get that out. And then also have the army of folks who are working on the fact checking and that sort of thing. And also growing, moving out of just the traditional media spaces and into more of um, the influencer spaces. It just has to be done. Barack Obama used that strategy successfully in the early days, but even social media has changed since his election, and so it has to be different now. And they took lessons from that and they mastered it, and that helped propel the last electoral success.
Wow, I love that action call almost, right? Of, well, here's a new way to organize and share information in a meaningful way. Because it is true, the lie just gets told. And actually, it feels sometimes hearing the what Elon Musk says, what the initial news media says, and what Trump says is almost like a game of telephone. It's like by the time it got to the last person, it becomes this whole other lie that is like I also think creates some level of confusion, right? Of like, well, I don't know, that just sounds nuts. They did this crazy thing, right? And that's the other thing I see when I read all sides media and I'll see a story, right, of what's being reported from, their spectrum is neutral to more left leaning to right leaning. And when I read a more right leaning story, what's so fascinating to me a lot of times is like the story itself is being buried underneath
Yes.
like emotion, like,
Yep.
oh, look at those progressive left-wing people now. They're all up in arms. And it's like so interesting to me because I'm like, wait, there's like a line about the actual thing here. And it's just about the fact that look how well what we did upset the
Right.
people you're against, right? This is so forget even the 2025 playbook. This is such an old playbook. Separate people, put them against each other as much as possible. And that just keeps people further segregated and siloed through this journey. Because if people really did come together and unite, like you said, under humanity, there would be a really different playbook that everybody would be behind. Well, not everybody, but a lot more people would be behind. And it's just we haven't found the way to overcome the ability of others to be able to separate us in that way.
It's stunning how this made up construct of race has played this enormous role in modern history, and has led to us doing horrific things to each other as human beings in the name of this made up construct that doesn't exist, right? When we're all just human beings, period. We all have more genetically in common than not. But that it is useful, it is a useful tool for those in search of power or in search of wealth or both to create these divisions that don't exist in science and build whole architectures around it. I'm thinking about Trump's recent call to, he's created a refugee status for white South Africans to come to the United States because the people who are 7% of the population, but who hold 90% of the land and wealth, are being treated terribly and being discriminated against. Um, but that, even then creating policy that's based on a construct that doesn't exist. And I think the sooner that we can really get past these phony constructs and just center on humanity and have empathy for each other as human beings, then we can connect to the horrors being visited upon people by the current policies of this administration.
Yeah. Well, we just talked a lot about the complex issues and corruption and dismantling that we're facing right now or witnessing and experiencing. When we had our initial conversation, you said something that I loved so much about being a chewable action. So, for our listeners, as we wrap here today, Reggie, what are some chewable actions that individuals can take to unite, rebuild, strengthen their communities?
If there is something locally that you care about, act on that. So, what does that look like? So, I live in New York City, and if there's too much trash in front of my building, I can get some of my neighbors together and we could sweep it up. That's just a small, right? And then that may turn into a block association. Then that may engage you with uh, your local city council member or whatever, and you move out from your real immediately needs. If I am a parent of a child and I care about books not being banned in my child's school, or I care about children not being demonized because of, that they're a trans kid or a gay kid, then I'm going to go to a school board meeting. I may even run for school board, right? Those are kind of the digestible things in terms of how where policy intersects with our day-to-day lived experience. Because the large parts that we talk about today, like the FBI and the IRS and these big government institutions, they seem very overwhelming. It seems impossible and like an avalanche. But it really starts from our small exercise of making our communities be what they want to be, and then feeling some confidence from that, and then being able to like look out, like, so who are the people who are, then that looks, I look out to my city councilman, I look out to my assemblyman, I look out to my state senator, my governor, and then I, out and out and out. But I start with what's the problem that is right where I live that I can be useful, because then that also creates the connective tissue with our neighbors, and it allows us to have conversations around what we have in common. And so that when we have larger conversations, there's a trust that's built there from those small interactions that we have together. So it seems in this time that it may take more than working with my block association to keep my little block safe and clean. But that's where it begins in terms of the connective tissue. So that, that would be my take.
I love that. Thank you, Reggie, for that. I think that is a very doable thing. It was spoken like a true educator and someone who is very grounded in social justice. So thank you so much. We always like to ask, where can our listeners follow and or connect with you?
Um, so I'm not really on social media like that. I'm on LinkedIn. So
Okay.
you put in Reginald Richardson, you can find me on LinkedIn. I do have a little local newspaper here in Brooklyn, the bkreader.com. So we are invested here in local news, and we have a few other local platforms as well, but bkreader.com. So you can see, we're Brooklyn hyper local news.
Love it.
Uh, Newspaper here. So you can go to bkreader.com and find us there.
Awesome. And we know where local news is, that people are more civically engaged and more likely to vote. So thank you for contributing to your community in that way. We know it's very important. Well,
It's a
thank
fight.
you.
It's a struggle. Yeah, we out there. We keep it going. It's the only black-owned daily newspaper, I think, in New York State.
Wow,
Yeah.
amazing. Amazing. Well, we're going to definitely share that in the links. Go ahead and sign up for that. And I guess also donate if you can. Hopefully you do take
Hey, we got a
donations.
donate button there, right? Because it's free. So
Awesome.
certainly.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Reggie. And thank all of you for listening to Educate US, a proud member of Leon Media Network. Make sure to download us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening via Apple Podcasts, be sure to leave us 5 stars because that really helps us out. And make sure to join the conversation by emailing the show at theeducateusshow@gmail.com. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.